Senator
All right.
Rubio.
Hey, sorry about
Hey.
that, guys. I apologize. I was running late. Something else ran over time, so.
I understand. I do. I know you're on a short time schedule, so we're going to go ahead and get started. We have kind of prepped our listeners and our viewers, Senator, for this discussion. We have it's one of our largest we've ever done, so we're grateful for your time to be here. I was just we were talking about kind of a history of you in the state of Florida, and I was talking about your 100 ideas when you were Speaker of the House and how many of those ideas became kind of a blueprint for much of what we're seeing come to fruition in the state of Florida. So kudos to you for that. It seems like 100 years ago, probably even longer to you, but that was just a terrific time when you were Speaker of the House with the 100 ideas.
Yeah, January seems like 100 years ago. So
yeah, doesn't it? It does. It does. Well, let's go ahead and get started. Obviously, Congress is back in session next week. There's been much discussion about next steps on the part of Congress. Obviously, the market reacts and swings, and not that that's what we're held hostage to, but it is certainly a reality of this country. What do you see happening in Congress moving forward when it comes back in session next week as some possibilities?
Yeah, so I think it's important to sort of separate short-term and sort of long-term. In the short term, we're responding to a crisis. And as part of our response to this crisis, there was expenses related to, for example, this fund that was put out there that a bunch of companies have responded to. And so you've got two pharmaceutical companies who are now in the final stage of testing of trials for a vaccine, unprecedented, speed. And a third that's right on their heels. So you could potentially have three separate American pharmaceutical companies responding to that innovation fund, developing a vaccine, which would now appear to be the fastest ever developed in human history on any front. And that of course, would alter everything. Part of that fund is also funding innovations in therapeutics. Don't ask me what it does, but mononuclear antibody therapies. I could explain it, but it would take forever. I don't exactly know the science on it. Other than that, it would be a dramatic therapeutic advance as well in treating the disease. So these are important things that are happening on the short term. And then there's the economic impact of it, which I equate to a taking. The government has a right under our laws for a public purpose to take private property, but they have to compensate you for it and its fair market value. Well, in essence, the government has taken your right to make money. It's taken your right to operate a business. It's taken your right to operate a business in the most effective way. And it's done so for a public purpose. And so the question is, what is government's role? There's no way we can make people whole, right? There's no government program that can sustain a functioning economy. But what you don't want to do is eviscerate sort of the small business backbone of the country that accounts for about 50 to 60% of our economic activity, because the scarring that creates makes it impossible to recover economically. So those are short-term struggles that we're going to face. And so, what can we do to help small businesses? My view has been that it should be very tied to jobs. We want to keep employers and employees attached as much as possible. There actually is a difference between being laid off and still having a job, even though you may not be working as many hours as you used to. Both psychologically and culturally, and also economically. When you try to restart your business, you may struggle to go find some of these employees to come back. So those are the short-term responses that we're going to continue to focus on. And I think it's been wise to wait a couple months to act again, because it's given us better insight as to the proper way to target this relief as instead of a scattershot approach. And then there's good news on the way with some of these innovations that I've mentioned, if we could just hold on a little longer. And then I think there's at some point now or in the future, some work to be done in the long term. And I think primarily that is, how do we align our national interest with our economic policy? And on that, I think we do need to sort of take a hard look at what's the role of industry in America? Can you be a great power and a great economy in the world today without having an industrial capacity, both from a national security perspective and then also from an economic perspective, because of the dignified jobs that it creates and the good jobs that it creates. And then what is the government's role in fostering an environment for that to be possible, especially in a world in which I think more than ever, you're going to see nations sort of line up behind their companies and allow them to unfairly compete. In essence, they're going to continue to demand unfettered access to our markets, even as they deny us access to theirs. and they're going to subsidize. Most Chinese national champion companies like Huawei and others are heavily subsidized by the Chinese government. And their
Sure.
goal is to underprice everybody until they put everybody else out of business, and then they own a global monopoly. So these are big long-term challenges that we have to confront as a country. I can tell you what the answer is not, and that is socialism. I think the question is, how do we focus the power of free enterprise towards the unique challenges of the 21st century? And that's really the big challenge we have on our hands from a long-term perspective. I don't think any of that's going to be solved in 3 months, but there's some growing consensus around some of those issues across party lines, and I think there's an opportunity there.
Great. Well, I want to talk about China a little bit more in just a couple minutes, but I think Bill had a quick follow-up question related to you all coming back together next week.
Yeah, we've seen some reports, Senator, that there may be discussion of an expansion of the child tax credit or possibly something on paid family leave in the next stimulus package. And that we found somewhat intriguing and unexpected. And I'm curious, we've noticed that you've made these issues priority in the past and have taken leadership in the Senate in that area. And I'm just curious to know, first, why you've taken this topic up, why you think it's important long term, and then I think the question is, will this be something that rises to the level of priority for this short-term stimulus package, or will it be something that the Congress decides to wait and act on later?
Yeah, so just at its most basic level, I think there has to be an understanding that a country, a nation, is not an economy. It's not a government. It's not an election. A nation is a society. It's in our case, over 300 million people who share this nation. And in order to have a strong country, it all really begins at the most basic level of human organization. That's the family, right? And if your families break down, which it's anchored by parenting, then everything else doesn't work. I mean, nothing else works if that very basic thing doesn't work. You know, it's like if you talk about football, if you can't tackle, it doesn't matter how fast you are and how hard you hit. If you can't tackle, you can't play, you know, and so, same, and it's a very basic element. So then the question is, all of our public policy should be pro-parent, and that's why I'm for school choice. I think parents should be the ultimate arbiter of what setting their kids should be in. One of the challenges parents face today is oftentimes when they have a birth of a child or an unexpected issue with a child, they don't have the flexibility to spend that parenting time. And ironically, the more money you make, or the likelier you are to have paid leave, the less money you make, the less likely you are to have it. Traditionally, the answer to that question has been, let's place a mandate on businesses and force them to pay for them, provide that benefit. There's a problem with that. First of all, you're making labor more expensive, and so it has a job harming possibility, and it has some unanticipated consequences. And I'll be frank, I think some employers would be encouraged to be less likely to hire people who would use that benefit. And you could see where that would play out very negatively. So as a result, the question is, okay, well, what can we do to incentivize or provide opportunities? And the first step was a bill that allowed companies to get credit on their taxes if they do provide paid leave. And that's a pilot program that was put in place by Senator Fisher in Nebraska, and that's been very positive. And the second is, how can we provide parents a paid option? And my view of it, which was the first bill out, is one that basically says that if you can take an advance on your future Social Security benefits in that time period. It doesn't add anything to the debt or deficit. It didn't cost any money. It's simply saying, it's a choice. You don't have to take it. You don't have to do it. Senator Cassidy of Louisiana has a proposal to actually make it an advance on the child tax credit. So whatever you were going to be due at the end of the year, you could just take it in advance in lieu of paid leave. So it's two ways to sort of get to the same problem. I'm not sure it will be part of this because, unfortunately, the Democrats' attitude towards it doesn't go far enough. They want a government program. They want it added into FICA and built as a government sort of sponsored program, and they want it to be a mandate. And that's for us. I think it's very counterproductive to go in that direction, and frankly goes too far. So, I think it's good we're talking about the issue and we care about it. I just don't think we want to create new problems in the name of solving a problem. And that's what I think the Democrats' approach would do.
Senator, two questions. Back to the idea of the role of Congress versus the role of the states in this kind of once-in-a-lifetime pandemic. we got some numbers today you may or may not be aware of. Florida's kind of snapped back a little bit. They added 275,000 new jobs. Unemployment rate dropped about 3.3%. So we're, there's far, long way to go. But having said that, how do you see the proper relationship as we deal with this pandemic between the role of the states and the role of Congress and the federal government as a whole?
Well, despite all the national criticism of not having one person in charge, I think federalism has been a great benefit because it's allowed not just every state, but every county to adjust policies to its local conditions. So we spent about a week, as we normally do around the 4th of July, up in Northwest Florida on a great part of the state. 6 out of the last 7 4th of Julys we've been up there. Except for 2015, because I was busy in 2015. I was in New Hampshire in 2015, but Northwest Florida is a place we've always gone, and the conditions there are just very different than they are in South Florida, and so it would be ridiculous to sort of ask them to have the same constraints in place that you would somewhere else that has different conditions in place. And so I think federalism has worked well in that regard. I think ultimately, beyond that, sort of the responses are certainly at the local level, and so I largely believe federalism has been very positive because it allows not just for flexibility, but for innovation. It allows for people to try different things. And if it works, everybody else is going to copy you. So for example, doctors learned not to ventilate patients too early or at all as a way to save lives and get better outcomes. And that's what they were doing in New York. And Florida doctors did it differently. And as a result, we're getting better outcomes now. So that sort of flexibility on every level, I think has been very positive. What I do think the federal government can do, and has done to the most part, and that is, large purchases in bulk and to be able to streamline some of it. So for example, remdesivir, which is a therapeutic that is cutting down hospital stays, when we had the issue with ventilator shortages and the ability of the federal government to sort of turn the private sector into ventilator makers for a while, to the point we now have a ventilator surplus, in case anyone's looking to buy a cheap one. Those are things that the federal government can do because of its purchasing power and its international reach. So I think on that front, largely, it's been very positive. And I think it's worked very well and continues to work well. I think there are unfair comparisons. How Florida's doing versus New York. New York has 33,000 deaths. They did a lot of things wrong in New York. They forced patients back into nursing homes, infecting and killing other people. In that regard, it's exactly the wrong thing to do. Even despite very disturbing numbers, both our death rate and our numbers are substantially better than New York. And we have more people. I mean, it's comparable, obviously, but we're more people. That doesn't mean it's all rosy and good. These cases are terrible in the places that are being impacted by it. But I do think that Florida has been able to do certain things that allowed us to handle the first wave better, and I think are going to help us get out of the second wave better. But we have some unique attributes here that you don't have in other states. I mean, Idaho's a great state, but we're not like Idaho.
Right.
We're just like the U.S. is not like New Zealand. There's some dramatic cultural, social, geographic, socioeconomic differences. And I think that's what federalism allows you to do, is to adjust for those.
Quick follow-up. Talk about, you obviously referenced China, world's second largest economy. Clearly there's been tension, but there's also needed relationship in terms of trade. Where do you see on the backside of this pandemic our relationship going with China in the next few years?
Let me say two things on the outset. Number one, China is going to be a rich, powerful country that we're going to have to deal with for the rest of our lifetimes and probably for many years after that. Second is I don't think we're entering a Cold War term that people throw around sometimes. It won't be like the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was they wanted to spread an ideology, right? They wanted more countries to sort of not just be part of their access, their Marxist access. They wanted countries to change their government. China's very different. China basically looks at the world and says, for most of human history, we've been the world's largest economy and they believe most powerful country. The last 100 years are an aberration of abuse by Westerners, particularly after World War II. And we need to correct that. We need to reclaim our right. It is our rightful place to be the dominant power in the Asia Pacific region and potentially the greatest and most powerful nation on earth. And you've really seen them accelerate on that front. The problem is they view that as a winner take all proposition. They are convinced that the only way they can be more powerful is for us to be less powerful. And you've seen them pursue it. We are responsible for allowing them to get as far as they have gone. You know, we after World War II, we had destroyed Japan and Germany, and we made a deal with those countries. And the deal was, don't have a military because you've started 2 wars already, and don't become part of the Warsaw Pact or the Soviet Axis. Instead, we're going to go ahead and let you cheat. We're going to let you go ahead and build up industries. You can sell anything you want here. We won't sell anything to you. We're going to take care of your defense needs. Obviously, that era has ended. We had the same approach with China when they were allowed to enter the World Trade Organization, and they ascended to that. Our attitude was, don't worry. Once they get rich, they'll become like us. They'll want the same rules we want. And in the last 5 years, there's been this massive realization that it ain't working that way. They have continued to deny us access to their market while trying to, and it's not unusual. This happened over and over again. So our relationship with China begins with that needs to be corrected. That imbalance needs to be corrected. They are no longer some poor developing country. They are a geopolitical competitor. They are increasingly an economic competitor, and they need to be treated as such. And we need to readjust our policies. They obviously don't like it, and they're obviously going to push back, and they're going to try to get as much as they want. And what they're counting on is that we have changes of government every 4 to 8 years, and that we'll lose focus on it. But you know, what we can't allow to happen is that the United States becomes basically a source of raw material for their industries. I mean, that cannot be who we become. And that, frankly, is the direction they want to take us. They want to buy soybeans, and they want to sell us a bunch of their electronics and consumer goods. And that's just not a good trade-off. It's not one we can accept, and it has national security implications.
Great. Last quick question. I'm going to flip it over to Bill because I know the audience has some questions. Also on the backside of this pandemic is going to be this whole notion of spending and spending in general from the federal government. How do you see us coming out of that in terms of long-term, just, you know, this whole notion of spending at the federal level?
Well, it's interesting to note that unlike at the state level, you know, where the budget is basically what you do every single year, the federal budget is almost over 2/3 of it Congress has no control over. I mean, it's mandatory spending. If you meet the requirements for Medicare that you've paid into, you get it. If you meet the requirements for Medicaid, you get it. If you meet the requirements of Social Security, you get it. We have no control over that spending. So really $2 out of $3 that are spent by the federal government are already spent just by formula, not by, so discretionary spending, of course, we always want to make sure we're not overspending on something, but you could, you know, take it down to the bone on discretionary spending and won't make a dent on our long-term spending program. The fundamental challenge we face is that our mandatory spending programs are growing at a pace that's far outstripping the revenue going into these programs. And eventually it's going to get you into trouble. So we've got to bring that under control. That requires reforms to Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, which you can imagine there's a lot of political resistance
to.
And which in frankness, I mean, this White House has made very clear they're not interested in doing that. Unfortunately, we're passing up an opportunity to make those reforms in a way that would not negatively impact anyone who's retired or about to retire, and would require really not draconian changes of any sort to people like me and others who are years away from retirement. The longer we wait, the less likely we'll have those kinds of options available to us. So that's one side of the equation. That has to happen. At some point, we have to correct that. The other side of the equation is you have to have economic growth, and that growth is going to produce the revenue. And if you're producing more revenue and you're spending it in a more disciplined way, then you begin to bring your debt load under control and a more sustainable path. You know, it's like when you buy a home, they only want it to be 30% of your income, you know, but if it's 60% of your income to service the mortgage, you're in trouble. And that's the situation we could find ourselves in. So we've got really economic growth has got to be a part of it. And it's got to be an economic growth that's driven not just by innovation, which is important, but also by higher wages that's produced by better paying jobs, which produced by increases in productivity and increases in innovation. These are the sorts of things that we need to be encouraging. You have to have both. You can't tax your way out of this. On the contrary, taxing your way out of it is almost cannibalism in the sense that you end up eating up the very thing you need to get you out of this deal and out of these problems.
Yeah, killing the golden goose. All right, I know we're getting a lot of questions via the Zoom. I'm going to turn it over to Bill to handle this part of the conversation.
And we are indeed getting a lot of good questions. And let me just start with this one that comes from a loyal JMI member. Former Vice President Biden said yesterday that he would abolish the U.S. Senate rule allowing a filibuster if elected and if necessary to his agenda. What are your thoughts about the filibuster and whether it should be preserved for the future?
Yeah, the filibuster, I know you guys know, but a lot of people fundamentally misunderstand it. There's a rule in the Senate that basically so this is not constitutional, it's the rule. And the rule basically says that you have the right to unlimited debate. When a senator begins to speak, no one can stop them from speaking until they're done. And the only way to stop them is you have to have a supermajority vote to end it. It used to be much higher, it's now down to 60. So that technically is what the filibuster is, and that is, it actually is never really exercised. No one actually goes to the floor and actually threatens to speak forever. But if you say you're going to, that alone denies you that. So a lot of people don't like it because it's an impediment to action. So I always view, well, how does that jive with our constitutional, what the Constitution envisioned the role of the Senate is? And the way the Senate was designed to actually be a place that made it hard to pass things. I know that people don't like to hear that. When you're in favor of something happening, you don't want it to be hard to do. But our system of government was created as such so that we have a House of Representatives, which represents the people, and their job is to be vibrant and move fast and sort of reflect the in some ways the passion of the moment. And then a Senate that was initially elected by state legislatures, that now, of course, by popular vote, that's supposed to represent the states. And their job was to slow things down and say, hold on a second, before we act, let's think about this some more. That was the design of it. And the filibuster reflects that. So if they end up changing the rules to do it, it'll fundamentally alter the character of the Senate, and from a place that sort of slows things down to a place that makes things happen. And there's a trade-off there. There's a lot of good things we'd love to do that we could do if we didn't have a filibuster. But the price of that is there's a lot of bad things that are going to get done if we don't. So I think it ultimately is going to make American politics a little bit more erratic. Now, what I do think needs to change is an abuse of it, right? So today, it used to be that you could get a uncontroversial district court judge, nobody's against it. And they were going to pass 95 to 5 because there's always 5 people that want to make a statement. And you could pass them without having to even file for cloture, which is how you break the filibuster. Because everybody says, look, I'm opposed, I'll vote against them, but there's no unnecessary need to add delay. Today, every single presidential nominee, every single one, is requiring a cloture vote. Clarence Thomas was one of the most controversial, well-documented, big fight over his nomination. They did not have to file cloture there was no filibuster on Clarence Thomas. They had a vote, and it was a majority vote, but they didn't have to file cloture. And today, everything has become that way. And look, Republicans did it a little bit when we were in the minority, but these guys are doing it on everything. It's an effort to nullify the presidency, basically. And so all that means is it just takes a lot longer to end up with the same result. And it's already been chipped away at a little bit anyways, the filibuster. So my view of it is, it isn't going to destroy the republic, but it will take us further away from the constitutional goal of having a Senate that slowed things down and required a little bit more deliberation and thought before we acted. At the end of the day, the federal government was not designed to do a lot. They deliberately designed it to make it hard to get things done. That's why we have all these checks and balances built in. And the further we get away from that, the further we get away from the design of our system that served us well for over 240 years.
Excellent. Here's another good question for you. You're currently the chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee, one of the most vital committees in the Congress. Without violating any specific rules, of course, what should we be concerned about in the latter half of this year? Is it more challenges from China, or are there other areas of concern?
Well, look, the job of the intelligence community is to gather the plans, intentions, and information on the plans, intentions, and activities of foreign powers so that they can inform our policymakers. And that, of course, is key to national defense, but it's also useful in things like trade and geopolitics in general. And we continue to do that better than anyone in the world. And we have incredible people that work on that. And we have great relationships with other countries who join interests in that. So our number one job is to oversee that and make sure it's working. And then, of course, there are the threats that are emerging on a daily basis. And so for many years, sort of the core of the intelligence community's job was anti-terrorism. And that, counterterrorism remains a vital and important area of focus. But it's now been joined by 4 others: Iran, North Korea, Russia, and China. Each have different things they're working on. The Russians, and going back before that, the Soviets, are masters of sort of social interference, sowing instability, sowing chaos in the country, injecting things into the national narrative that weaken you internally. They did it before. The only difference is now, they've got witting and unwitting accomplices on social media, in sometimes the traditional media that isn't even realizing that they're furthering some of these narratives. And Vladimir Putin isn't creating any of our conflicts. He's simply exacerbating and pushing on some of our pre-existing ones. That's going to be a threat in 2020, and it's going to be a threat in years beyond it. I think other countries are going to start getting into the business of that. The Iranians and the Chinese for sure. I think in the long term, the Chinese pose a much more serious counterintelligence threat because theirs spans the scope. There's commercial espionage. The Chinese are much more likely to buy a company so they can acquire their secrets than they are to hack into their computer, but they'll do both. You've seen it in academia, where they are able to concoct sometimes secret deals with a top researcher in an American university whose basic research is built on government funding, and then these people are getting the side contract and handing it over to the Chinese for them to, so they're getting all this free research paid by you and I. So these are real threats, and these are going to be ongoing threats that will extend beyond the 2020 election. But I think you can expect a lot of activity in 2020, primarily on the front of sowing instability and chaos. And so we'll develop a vaccine, and you'll see some effort out there to sow conspiracy theories that the vaccine doesn't work and it'll actually kill you and get us to fight over that and more. So we saw a lot of that kind of activity during the George Floyd protests a few weeks ago. So these are ongoing threats, and our primary job in the intelligence community in the committee is to oversee what our agencies, how accurate is the information, how much information are they gathering, how accurate is it, and then how is it being followed up on.
Very good. Here's another question from one of our viewers. The Supreme Court just completed its rulings for the latest term. You obviously supported each of the two most recent additions to the court. We're curious to know how you felt about the court's most recent term. Were you pleased? Were you surprised? Were you disappointed? Any rulings that particularly caught your attention?
You know, I think it's when we talk about the court, it's always important to separate between, do you agree with the policy outcome, the results from the ruling, and the justification for the ruling. And so I believe the job of the Supreme Court, which is an appellate court, is to consider the question before them and ask itself, is it constitutional or not, on the basis of the plain text of the Constitution and the intent. If someone doesn't like something that's in the Constitution, if we believe something is missing in the Constitution, it is not the job of the court to create that. That's why we have a constitutional amendment process. And so oftentimes when people view these rulings, they make their opinion on the basis of whether they agree with the outcome or not. And where I was disturbed on at least 3 separate occasions in this term is both on the school ruling regarding discrimination, on the abortion ruling out of Louisiana, as 2 examples, is where the court sort of seemed to reach for a policy outcome as opposed to justify the plain meaning of the term. That doesn't, look, I could agree with a policy outcome, but disagree that it's the court's job to do it. So a lot of people think, well, what's the harm? You know, if Congress is gridlocked and society can't agree, we need these 9 distinguished grown-ups to come in and sort of step in the role of what we're failing and fill in the gap. But I think that's extraordinarily dangerous. When you bypass the legislative process, when you in essence mandate things on a society because it can't get done through the political branches, it creates extraordinary amount of friction in a country over those issues because you don't give the country the opportunity to debate and work through it, even though it takes longer to do. Now, in some instances, clearly, if you go back to the civil rights movement and things of that nature, the plain reading of the Constitution, even though there were amendments that were done to clarify and get around what states were doing to evade the Constitution, that is an opportunity for both constitutional amendments that took place after the Civil War and again in the 60s, and also an opportunity to fulfill the very founding principles of equality in our country. But we've gone much further than that now. And I think now what we're trying, now they're sort of reaching for policy decisions. So it's disappointing to see Justice Roberts sort of line up 3 times in that direction. And, you know, I don't know all that goes into it, but when you read these rulings, you can sort of see that these are very distinguished jurists and lawyers who are very good at creating very novel and creative ways of justifying how they reached a policy conclusion through the lens of legal language. And I just think that's the wrong direction for the court to be headed. Very
good. Another question here. You recently became the co-chair of the Senate Entrepreneurship Caucus. Tell us a little about your priorities for that group and its work?
Well, I think that the design behind that is the same as my chairmanship for small business and entrepreneurship. And that is the belief that one of the things that gives an economy vibrancy is when an individual is able to quit the job they have and open up a business out of the spare bedroom of their home, and or take a risk and be successful. And a lot of times people are going to fail in that endeavor. And oftentimes some of the great American companies and great American ideas are the product of 9 previous failures, or 8 or 7 or 6. But you have to have an environment that encourages that. And so what we're trying to do is sort of what policies can encourage that. And I think entrepreneurship is as important as it's ever been, whether it's creating something new or commercializing something that's been created. The ability to sort of either take something that's been developed for the space program as an example, and then commercialize that into daily life, or whether it's coming up with something that no one ever thought of before. That sort of creativity, that sort of vibrancy is what gives life to an economy and allows you not to have the sort of oligarchy that generation after generation governs a country's economy. And so we want to figure out what are the impediments to entrepreneurship, and what can we do, hopefully in a bipartisan way, to remove them.
Very good. Unfortunately, we're not going to have any additional time for any more questions. Thank all of you for submitting questions. I want to kick things back to Bob for any closing thoughts and questions, and to give him an opportunity, if he wishes, to press Senator Rubio on that all-important gator shirt question that we were talking about when he joined us.
Yeah, what's the gator shirt question?
Well, we're talking about on your social media, Senator, your preference of wearing the orange and blue in Gainesville, but we'll get to that another day. I want to close with
what other choice? I don't know what the other alternative is.
we had a viewer who wrote in and said, why does he wear a gator shirt on his Twitter picture rather than one from the University of West Florida, which is now a Division II national champ?
They are. I don't have a West Florida shirt. If you send me one, it'd be great. I'd love to have it. But that's just what I found in my closet that day.
There you go.
I just happen to have a lot of them.
Yeah. Senator, thanks again for joining us. I had one final question I want to ask you about, and this is more of a philosophical question related to kind of the founding of this country, and then we're going to wrap things up. Obviously, the nation has a long history of peaceful protest. What are your thoughts on, whether it's the Tea Party or the peaceful protests of Martin Luther King or the wisdom of Booker T. Washington or what have you? What do you see culturally today in terms of what is happening in our nation? And as our viewers and listeners are watching and listening to you today, what are your thoughts on kind of, is there a distinction between what we're seeing happening today versus kind of the long history of the use of the First Amendment in this great country?
Well, let me first say that, statistics generally don't lie. And so there are inequalities in home ownership, in job creation, in small businesses, in salary and educational attainment that break out among racial and ethnic lines is indisputable. They are there. And we as a nation should look at that and say, why are these inequities there, and how can we remove them? Because they speak directly against the promise of America, which is equal fairness and equality for all, irrespective of your religion, your gender, your race, your ethnicity. And I think in many ways, obviously, there's a reality that in many communities across this country, the police departments and the communities they are there to serve and protect do not have good relationships, and that needs to be confronted. And every police department has a different relationship, and that's where local government can be very important as well. And so I support people who take to the streets and speak about those issues. Now, there's a distinction between that and people that sort of view these protests as an opportunity for an unrelated agenda, and they manifest it through fire bombings, arson, vandalism. There's a difference between that. Same with namings. If some monument is offensive, if the name of a military facility is offensive, if some plaque somewhere is offensive and you want to change it, there is and has to be a process where you can petition the people who decided to put it there to change it or replace it. We're replacing one of the statues in Statutory Hall that represents the state of Florida. Let me tell you what the process is not. It is not that 10 people decide we're going to go out with ropes and chains and tear down the statues that we decide are offensive. That is not the process. That's called anarchy. That speaks for no one. And in fact, anarchy breeds, counter violence, and violence and anarchy breeds retaliation. And it only sort of undermines your economy. Now, look, I'm not going to ignore the fact that as these protests went on, it became less and less about people talking about racial inequality and more about people wearing Che Guevara T-shirts and spray painting hammers and sickles on signs. So I can't speak for the whole country, but I can tell you in many parts of Florida, particularly South Florida, these protesters are known Marxists. And when they have a megaphone and they're speaking to why America should be more like Nicaragua and Venezuela and Cuba, and the media covers them as police protesters, I have a problem with it, because you're ignoring what they said and who they are. And I think you can support peaceful protests, and I think you can be supportive of efforts to address social inequality and racial inequality, but not be supportive of anarchy, chaos, violence, arson, looting that harms innocent people and brings disorder to our country. And in fact, many of the people who were protesting had some of the same concerns. They would tell you, we don't know who these people are that are showing up and they're here agitating and creating problems. So I think, it's an important time to be reminded of that. And I think that's carried over into other parts of this counterculture. This cancel culture that's out there now, where we want to silence speech because you don't agree with someone. Free speech is difficult because it means people have a right to lie, to be stupid, and to say things that are offensive. But that's the price you pay for the right to rebut them freely and to give your own opinions on things. My response to people that are offensive and I don't like is, A, I don't listen to them. I change the channel or just don't read what they write or don't go to their speeches. And B is, if you can't do that, you rebut them with evidence and with free speech of your own. We're down a slippery slope here now, however, when the corporate world seems to have jumped on this bandwagon of, if you don't meet the orthodoxy that someone has decided, no one's voted on it, we're going to punish, we're going to destroy your life, destroy your business, destroy your reputation. That's a very, very dangerous direction we've now headed, and where there is no freedom of expression and debate. It goes contrary to everything, the sorts of freedoms you need in a country in order to make real progress.
Well, Senator, I want to thank you for joining us today. I know your time schedule has been packed. We're grateful for not only the way you represent the Sunshine State, but also for your fight for liberty and founding ideals and the principles that we share here at the James Madison Institute. So thanks again for joining us. We're grateful for it.
Thank you, guys. Thanks for giving me the chance to do it. I apologize. I was a few minutes late.
No worries at all. And I want to thank all of our Zoom callers for joining today. As we said, largest one we've ever had. You can learn more at jamesmadison.org. There were a few questions we weren't able to get to, so I'm sorry about that. But again, I want to thank everybody for joining us today, and we'll look forward to seeing you again soon. Thanks.